10. The king's shield entered the storm late into its fifth day of Reikul. Kara had hoped that the foul weather would break up before they confronted it, but in truth, those who manned the ship had only themselves to blame for this new situation. Captain Geronin commanded an excellent crew, one that understood well the idiosyncrasies of the turbulent sea. The necromancer doubted that any other vessel could have plied the waters as efficiently and with such remarkable speed as this one, which unfortunately had virtually guaranteed that the king's shield would outrace even this swiftly moving tempest. The unfortunate Kalkos had been given a formal burial at sea, Kara adding to the ceremony with a few words of respect based on the funeral traditions of her people. In her eyes, Kalkos had only transcended to another plane, where, in his new existence, he and those before him would work to maintain the balance of all things. However, she felt some guilt, some misgivings about the prayer she said. The pale enchantress had not forgotten her own deep desire to live when she had found herself entombed in the tree. Kara's only way so far to reconcile that her general beliefs had been to decide that, if she had perished, it would not only have to upset the balance, but it would also left no one who could have tracked down the missing armor. That could not be allowed to happen. Almost immediately upon entering the storm-tossed waters, Kara Nightshadow took it upon herself to spend much of her time watching the wild seas from the bow. Girona questioned the sanity of this, but she refused all suggestions that she return to the safety of her cabin. He thought that she watched for the hawk's fire. In part, in truth, what she actually concerned her more had been the possibility that the demons of Kalko's memories might possibly return, especially the aquatic leviathan that had slain the majority of the other vessel's crew in such a horrible manner. Having still not mentioned its existence to Captain, Kara felt honor bound to at least keep watch. She also believed that, of all of them, she had the best chance of doing something to either scare it off or possibly distract it while the king's shield attempted to escape. Even though caught between the harsh rain and the mad sea, Geronim's crew remained determined and, her, too, quite polite. For a time, Kara had feared that the stories she had always heard about sailors would mean her having to deflect unwanted attention. However, although several of the men clearly admired her, and that despite now knowing her true calling, they did not press. In fact, only Mr. Draco had attempted anything resembling an advance, and he had not done so formal and cautious a matter that it had almost been as if one of her own had made entreaties. She had kindly and quietly rejected his advance, but had found no attention flattering. Captain Geronin himself had long ago erased any lingering question as to whether he had designs on his passenger. When he did not treat Kara like an aristocrat client, he acted as if at some point she had been adopted into his new house. Now and then the formal naval officer fussed over her just as Carr suspected he had fussed over Terena. She allowed him to do that, not only because it kept him in such good spirits, but because the necromancer also found it made her feel somewhat comfortable as well. Growing up, she had not been without parental love, but once her adult training had begun, the faithful of Rothma were expected to put such emotions aside for the better good of learning how best to protect the balance of the world. The balance had to come before all else, even family. The king's shield leapt up a particularly high wave, crashing down into the water a second or two later. Kara held the rail tight, trying to see past the rain and mist. More accustomed to seeing in the dark, let her better view that might lay ahead than any of the more experienced mariners. By now they had surely reached even past the waters in which Kakos and his comrades had perished, and that meant that at any moment the entire vessel might be under attack by forces unnatural. Lady Kara! Draco called from behind her. It's getting worse! You really should get below. I'm fine. Although certainly no highborn lady, the dark mage could not get the men to simply call her by her name. That had been the fault of Geronin, who had, on first introducing her to the crew, emphasized the title, and, most important, his respect for her. What served their captain well served the crew. But the storm! Thank you for your concern, Mr. Draco. He already knew better than to argue with her. Just be careful, my lady. As he battled his way back, Kara decided that the consideration she had received from Geronin and his men would certainly spoil her for Luke Ghislaine. There, she knew she would face the prejudices more common toward her kind. Necromancers dealt with death, and most folk did not like to be reminded of their mortality, nor the fact that their spirits could perhaps be affected by those like her afterwards. Despite her refusal to Draco, the necromancer soon decided that she should not stay at the bow much longer. The coming night, combined with the horrific weather, reduced visibility with each passing second. It was quickly coming to the point where even she would be of no use. Yet she remained determined to stand her post as long as humanly possible. Up and down the waves flowed, their continual rise and fall, in some ways a monstrous sight despite the spectacle of such raw power at work. Once or twice she had spotted what she believed some sea creature, and much earlier, a piece of rotting wood had momentarily broken the cycle, but other than that, Kara had little to show for her efforts. Of course, that also meant that there had been no sign of the demons, something for which the enchantress could feel grateful. She wiped the spray and rain from her eyes, turning her gaze one last time to the port side of the king's shield. More waves, more froth, more... An arm? Shifting her position, Kara peered into the dark waters, every sense alert. There! An arm and a part of an upper body of a man. She could make out no detail, but swore she saw the waterlogged limb rise of its own accord. Kara had no quick spell for such a situation, and so turned instead back to the deck, and the dwindling figure of Geronin second. Mr. Draco! A man in the sea! Fortunately, he heard her immediately. Calling to three other men, Draco rushed up to where the necromancer stood. Show me where! Look! Can you see him? He studied the mad waters, then nodded grimly. A head and an arm, and I think it might be moving. Draco shouted to the helmsman to bring the ship about, then, in a much more subdued voice, told her, It's unlikely that we'll be able to save him at this point, but we will try. She did not bother to reply, more aware of the odds that even he could be. If the nature of the balance dictated the man's survival, he would be rescued. If not, then like Kalkos, his soul would go on to the next plane of his existence, there to fulfill another role for the balance, as taught in the teachings of Rathma. Of course, that same balance also dictated that where there remained hope of life, those that had not struggled to save it, Rathma taught pragmatism, not cold-heartedness. The storm made for rough going, but despite that the king's shield still managed to close in on the feebly struggling form. Unfortunately, the coming of night made the task more and more difficult, as the vague figure vanished and reappeared with every new wave. By this time, Captain Geronin had joined his crew, taking over control of the situation. To Kara's surprise, he commanded two sailors to bring bows. Sailors Draco informed her were exceptionally skilled with the weapons. Does this mean to them to end the man's suffering? She asked, startled by the sight of the former officer. Kara had at least expected him to try to save the unfortunate mariner. Just watch me, lady. Her eyes narrowed in belated understanding as the archers quickly tied rope to their shafts. Rather than trying to simply toss a line to the man in the water, they hoped to use the shafts to better get the ropes within reach. Even with the storm, they could get more precision from using the bows than relying on hands only. A risky venture still, but one with more chance of success. Hurry, blast you! Geronin roared. The two men fired. One arrow soared far past its target, but the second came within a short distance of the rolling form. Grab hold! Draco shouted. Grab hold! The man made no move toward the line. Taking a terrible risk, the necromancer leaned over the rail, trying to will the floating rope closer. Perhaps if it actually touched him, he would react. Kara knew elders who could move objects simply by thinking of them, but as with so much else, her studies in that respect had not reached such a point. She could only hope that her desperation, combined with what abilities she had already learned, might prove enough at this dire moment. Whether due to her desperate thoughts or merely the whims of the sea, the lion came within inches of the man's arm. Grab it! The captain encouraged. Suddenly, the body jerked. A wave washed over it, and, for a few nerve-wracking seconds, the hapless figure vanished. Kara sighted it first, now several yards from either line. Dom! Draco pounded his fist on the rail. Either he's dead or... The floating form jerked again, almost going under. The first officer swore. That's not the waves doing that! In growing dread, Kara and the crew watched as the body bobbed twice more and then went under. This time it did not reappear. The sharks have gotten him, one of the sailors finally muttered. Captain Dronin agreed. Drawing the lines, lad! You did what you could. Odds were he was already dead anyway, and we've got ourselves to worry about more, eh? The mood dampened by the futility of the efforts. The crew slowly returned to their tasks. Mr. Draco stayed behind for a moment with Kara, who still sought some last glimpse of the lost mariner. The sea claims its own, he whispered. We try to learn to live with it. We see it as a part of the overall balance, she returned. But the loss of a life that might have been saved is still to be mourned. You'd best come away from there, my lady. Touching the back of his hand very briefly, Kara replied, Thank you for your concern, but I wish to remain for a moment. I will be all right. With reluctance, he left her once again. Alone, the necromancer reached into her cloak and removed from around her throat a small red icon shaped in the likeness of a fearsome dragon with blazing eyes and savage teeth. The followers of Rothman believed that the world sat upon the back of the great dragon, Trang Owl, who acted as a fulcrum and, as such, helped maintain the celestial balance. All necromancers gave their full respect to the fiery Leviathan. Under her breath, Kara prayed that Trang Owl would see the unknown man to the next plane of his existence. She had prayed the same for the sailor Kalkos, although none of the King's Shield crew had noticed. Outsiders did not readily comprehend the place of Trang Owl in the world. Satisfied that she could do no more, the slim, silver-eyed woman returned to her cabin below deck. Despite her dedication to her task, Kara entered the room with much relief. Standing lookout for demons, then watching the rescue attempt fail, had drained much of her strength. During the enchantress's self-imposed task, she had taken only minimal breaks for her meals, and had, in truth, been on her feet longer than any of the men. Now all Kara wanted to do was sleep, and sleep, and sleep some more. The cabin offered to her by Hannes Dronin had been originally set aside for his daughter, and so the more atmosphere Kara had to deal with ladylike frills and 2 soft pillows. Unlike the crew, she also had a true bed, one secured very well to the floor in order to prevent it from sliding across the room. To further ensure her safety while she slept, the bed also had short padded rails on each side to keep the occupant from rolling off onto the hard wooden floor during the worst storms. Kara already found herself grateful more than once for those rails, and especially appreciated them now. So exhausted did she feel, the necromancer doubted that tonight she would have had the strength to hold on by herself. Throwing off her wet cloak, Kara sat at the bottom edge of the bed, trying to collect her thoughts. Despite the cloak, her garments, too, had been thoroughly soaked. From her jet black blouse down to her leather pants and boots, the dampness of the blouse made it cling tight, chilling her further. Dronin had been dismayed that the necromancer had not brought any other garments with her and had insisted before the voyage on locating at least one more set of clothes. Kara had only relented when he had agreed that they would resemble her own black garments as much as possible. The teachings of Rathma did not include interest in the latest fashions. The necromancer sought only functional, durable clothing. Grateful now that she had given in, and much that Kara changed quickly into the second set, hanging others to dry. She had performed the same exact ritual each night of the voyage, doing what she could to keep everything clean. Because one dealt with blood and death did not mean that cleanliness was no longer an option. For once, the young woman found the so-soft bed a very welcome thing. The captain would have been dismayed had he known she slept fully clothed, but on a journey of this nature, Kara could take no chances. If the demons of Kalko's memories did materialize, she had to be ready for them immediately. Her only compromise to comfort concerned her boots, which, out of respect for Jeronin and his daughter, she left by the bottom of the bed. Lantern doused, Kara Night Shadow sank deep into the bed. The wild waves actually worked to more quickly send her off drifting to sleep, rocking the weary mage back and forth as if in a cradle. The troubles of the world began to recede until a blue faint light seeped through her eyelids, pulling her from the slumber. At first she thought it a figment of some peripheral dream, but then the gradual realization that Kara still sensed it through closed eyes, even while awake, set every nerve on edge. The dark mage tensed, then spun about in the bed, rising to a kneeling position with her hands pointed toward the source of the surreal illumination. Situated in the cabin below the waterline, Kara at first imagined that somehow the sea had finally broken through the hole. However, as the last vestiges of sleep faded from her mind, she saw instead something far more unsettling. The blue light from her dreams not only existed, but now covered a fair portion of the side of her cabin. It had a hazy look to it, almost as if the wall had turned to mist, and pulsated continually. Kara felt her entire body tingle. Through the magical haze stepped not one, but two water-soaked figures. She opened her mouth whether to cast a spell or call out for help. Even Kara could not completely be certain. In either case, her voice and her body as a whole in act failed. The necromancer did not understand why until one of the dark figures held out a familiar ivory dagger. A dagger that blazed an unsettling blue each time Kara even thought of attempting anything. The dripping and quiet dead figure of the Vajeri sorcerer Fatson, the gaping hole where the throat had once been, partially obscured by the collar of his cloak, grimly stared at her, his unblinking eyes silent, warning Kara of the foolishness of any defiance. Next to him, his grinning companion shook off some of the seawater. Behind them, a blue light faded away, the Revenant's magical portal vanishing with it. The smaller of the two undead took a step toward her, performing a mocking bow. As she did, Kara realized that it had been his body she and the crew had seen. He had been the helpless mariner. Fatson and his friend had been tricked to her crew in order to arrange this monstrous visitation. The ghoul's smile widened, yellow teeth and rotting gums now adding to the initial image of peeling skin and wet, purifying flesh beneath. So, very good to see you again, necromancer. If the storm did not end by the time the Hawksfire at least reached the harbor of Luco Lane, then at least it finally eased to something approaching tolerable. For that, Nork Viserin gave thanks. Just as he gave thanks that the ship had arrived just prior to sunrise, when most of the kingdom would still be asleep and, therefore, would not so much notice the sinister peculiarities of the dark vessel. The moment the Hawksfire docked, the spell cast by the armor ceased, leaving Captain Costco and Nora to do the best they could to finish matters. The ship drew the stares of those few about, but fortunately it seemed that no one had noticed lines adjusting themselves, nor sails lowering without physical aid. When finally the gangplank had been lowered, Costco made clear with his expression, if not words, that the time had come for his passenger to disembark. and hopefully never return. Norik reached out a hand and, in an attempt, made some sort of peace with the skeletal foreign mariner. But Costco glanced down at the gauntlet with his good eye, set the same eye unblinking on the soldier's own gaze. After a few seconds of unease, Nork lowered the hand and quickly walked down the gangplank. However, a few yards from the Hawksfire, he could not help but look back one last time, and therefore saw the captain still watching him closely. For several seconds, the two stared at one another. Then Costco slowly raised one hand Nork's way. The veteran fighter nodded in return, seemingly satisfied by this minor exchange. Costco lowered his hand and turned away, now seemingly intent only on inspection of his badly damaged vessel. Norik had barely taken a step when someone called down to him from another direction. "The Hawksfire tricks fate again." An elderly-looking sea captain with almond-shaped eyes, a white tuft of beard, and weathered features remarked from the deck of his own vessel. Despite the early hour and the foul weather, he greeted Norik with a cheerful smile. "But looks like barely this time. Rode along with the storm, did ye?" The soldier only nodded. "Word to the wise, ye been fortunate. Not every man that sailed her has finished the voyage. She has bad luck, especially to her captain." More so than ever, thought Norik, although he dared not tell the other captain. He nodded again, then tried to move on, but the elderly mariner called out once more. "Here now! After a trip like that, ye've no doubt the need for a tavern. The best one is Atma's. The good lady herself still runs it, even what with her husband gone now. Tell them Captain Mischief said to treat ye well." "Thank you," came Norik muttered back, hoping that the short answer would satisfy the much too cheerful man. He wanted to be away from the docks as quickly as possible, still fearful that someone would not only recognize something amiss with the arrival of the Hawksfire, but also link Norik to it. Cloak drawn about him, the weary veteran hurried on. After several anxious minutes, at last leaving ships and warehouses behind and entering the true fabled Lucal Lane, he had heard tales about the kingdom, often over the years, but had never visited it before. Satan Trist had said of it that anything a man could buy, he could find here, and in great quantities. Ships came from all over the world, bringing in goods both legal and not. Lucal Lane represented the most open of markets, although those who ruled made certain that order was still constantly maintained. At no time did the entire city sleep. According to Satan, one only had to look long enough, and one would find a place willing to let those seeking exotic entertainments spend their coin no matter what the hour. Of course, those who could not keep their entertainments confined to the faculties provided still risked running afoul of the watchful eye of the guard, who served the cause of the Sultan with great fervor. Trist himself had told some quite lurid tales about Lucal Lane's dungeons. Despite all that had happened to him since the tomb, Norik's interest stirred almost immediately as he walked through the streets. All around him, gaily decorated buildings of mortar and stone rose tall, the banners of the Sultan atop each. Along the astonishingly clean cobblestone streets that stretched in every direction, the first wagons of the day began to emerge, as if sprouting from the very shadows. Quick-moving figures in flowing robes began opening tents and doors in preparation for new business. Some of the wagons paused at these tents, suppliers delivering new goods to the vendors. The storm had dwindled now to a few dark rumbling clouds, and with its continued lessening, Norik's mood lightened yet more. So far the armor had not demanded anything more of him. Perhaps he could, for a time, at least seek his own path. In a place as vast as Lucal Lane, surely there had to be sorcerers of some repute, sorcerers who could help him free him of this curse. Under the pretext of admiring the sights, an easy enough thing to do, Norik would try to keep his eye out for any signs of possible help. Within moments of the dawn, the streets filled with people of all shapes, sizes, and races. Travelers from as far away as Inkstein and Candoras walked among the dark-clad visitors from Kyrgyzstan and beyond. In fact, there seemed more outsiders than locals. The very crowd worked in Nork's favor, enabling him to fit in without much suspicion. Even the armor did not overly mark him, for other figures clad akin to him appeared everywhere. Some of them had clearly disembarked from ships not all that long ago, while others, especially those with turbined helms and elegant silver capes fluttering behind their blue-gray breastplates, obviously served the masters of this fair kingdom. Overall, the architecture remained constant, with the low floors of buildings a smooth rectangular shape, while quite often the tops tended towards small towers resembling minarets. A peculiar design, especially to one born and raised among the high, turreted castles of lords and the lowly, thatched dominicals and peasantry, but one of with an exotic quality that caused Nork to marvel over it and over again. No two buildings were exactly the same, either some being broader, even squat, while others appeared to be making up for the lack of space on the ground by stretching thinner and higher. A horn sounded, and the street around Newark suddenly emptied of people. Following suit, he narrowly missed being run over by a mounted patrol clad in some turbine helmets and breastplates he had seen earlier. A lively, active city Luke Lane might be, but as Satan had said, it also looked to be well policed. That made it all the more curious that no one had stopped Newark on the docks for at least some questioning. Most major seaports kept security strong day and night, but he had seen no one. Despite Luke Lane's open reputation, it puzzled him. Hunger and thirst slowly crept upon him as he wandered along. He had eaten some food aboard the Hawksfire, but his interest in reaching the docks had kept him from taking his fill. Besides, it had been Norik's secret hope to find something in the city, rather than stomach yet another portion of Costco's unsettling concoctions. The armor had provided funds before, and so, with some confidence, the veteran looked around. Several taverns and inns of various demeanor dotted the area, but one in particular instantly caught Norik's eye. "Best one's Adamas! Tell them Captain Mischief said to treat you well!" The same tavern stood but a few yards from the soldier, the wooden sign with its bleary orbed mascot hanging directly over the entrance. A hardy, weathered place, but one still honest enough in looks for him to risk without worry. Without so much as determination as he could still muster, Nork headed toward it, hoping against hope that the armor would not suddenly turn him elsewhere. He entered in peace and of his own free will, something which, along with his new surroundings, raised Nork's hopes further. Despite the early hour, Adama had a good business going. Most of its customers seamen, but a few merchants, tourists, and military figures partaking of its offerings as well. Not wanting to draw too much attention to himself, Nork chose a booth in one of the corners and sat down. A slip of a girl came too young to be working in any establishment, came up to take his order. Nork's nostrils had already pinpointed something cooking in the back, so he risked ordering whatever it might be, plus a mug of ale to rinse it down. The girl curtsied, then hurried off, giving him the opportunity to look around. He had spent far too much of his life in taverns and in inns, but at least this one did not look as if the cooks would be broiling whatever they could catch in their floor traps. The servers kept the tables and floors relatively clean of refuse, and none of the customers had so far choked on either their meals or drinks. Overall, Atmos verified his opinions of Lukolain as a kingdom in the midst of tremendous prosperity, where everyone appeared to be befitting even the lower castes. The girl returned with his food, which actually looked as good as it smelled. She smiled at him, asking for what it seemed to be reasonable coin. Nork eyed his gloved hand, waiting. Nothing happened. The gauntlet did not slam down on the table, leaving the proper amount. Nork tried to show his sudden anxiety, but the armor let him trap himself. If he could not pray in the least that they would throw him out again. He glanced toward the door where two brawny enforcers who had not bothered to look at him on his way in now seemed more interested in his discussion with the serving girl. She repeated the amount, this time less friendly expression on her face. Nort glared at the glove, thinking, "Come on, damn you! All I want is a good meal. You can do that, can't you?" Still nothing. "Is there something wrong?" the girl asked, her expression indicating that she thought she already knew the answer. Nork did not reply, closing the open his hand in the fading hope that some coins would magically appear. With one glance toward the two enforcers, the young server began to back away. "Excuse me, sir. I've got other tables." The soldier looked past her, where the muscular pair had begun to move in his direction. The girl's actions had been a clear sign for them to do their work. He rose, planting his hands on the table. "Wait! It's not what you—" Under his palm he heard the tinkle of coins as they struck the table. She heard them too, and the smile suddenly returned. Nork sat back down, indicating the tiny pile now before him. "I'm sorry for the confusion. I've not been to Luke Lane before, and I had to think whether I might be the right amount. Is that enough?" Her expression told him all he needed to really know. "Aye, sir. Enough and much more." Over his shoulder, he saw the burly pair hesitate. The larger of the two duo tapped his companion on the arm, and the two men returned to their posts. "Take what you need for food and drink," he told the girl, feeling much more relieved. After she had done that, Nork added, "And the largest coin left for yourself." Thank you, sir." She nearly floated back to the counter from the looks of things, having received the largest tip of her life from him. The sight cheered Nork briefly. At least some little good had come from the cursed armor. He stared at the gauntlets, well aware of what had just happened. The suit had let him understand without words that it, and not he, controlled the entire situation. Nork lived his life through his sufferings. To think otherwise was to play the fool. Regardless of the reality of his dilemma, Nork managed to enjoy his meal. Compared to Captain Costco's fare, it tasted of heaven. Thinking of that mystical realm, the soldier pondered his next move. The armor kept a close rein on him, but surely there had to be a way to get past his guard. In a realm as vibrant as Lane, not only sorcerers but priests had to be found in ambulance. Even if the former could do nothing for Nork, then perhaps a servant of heaven might. Surely a priest had links to forces far more powerful than an enchanted suit. But how much to speak with one? Nork wondered if the armor could withstand being on holy ground. Could it be so simple as walking past a church and then throwing himself into the steps? Would he be able to do even that much? For a desperate man, it seemed worth a try. The armor needed him alive and relatively well. That alone might give him enough of an opportunity. At the very least, Nork had to try for the sake of not only his life, but his soul too. He finished his meal, then quickly downed what remained of the ale. During that time, the serving girl came back more than once to see if he needed anything, a clear sign that he had been very generous in his tipping. Nork gave her one smaller coin remaining to him, which caused her to smile, to somehow grow even wider than before. Then he casually asked her about something of the sights of the city. "There's an arena, of course," the girl Miriam replied quickly, no doubt having been asked the question more than once by newcomers. "And the palace, too. You must see the palace." Her eyes took on a dreaming look. "Jaren, the Sultan lives there." This Jaren evidently had to be a handsome and fairly young man, judging from Miriam's rapt expression. While the Sultan's palace surely had to be an intriguing sight, it had not been what been searching for. And besides that, there's also the Arogos Theater near the square with the Cathedral of Thomas and the Repentant across from it. But the Zakarum priests only allow visitors at midday, and the theater is being repaired. Oh, there's races on the far north side of the city. Horses and dogs." Nork ceased listening. The information he had needed now his. If Holy Ground or Haven had any power over the demonic legacy of Bartek, then this cathedral offered the best hope. The Zakharum Church represented the most powerful order on either side of the Twin Seas. And some old folk and scholars liken the ruins of the Vajeri Temple outside the city walls, though there's not much to see anymore after the great sandstorm. Thank you, Miriam. That's good enough. He prepared to leave, already trying to think of some roundabout method by which to approach the vicinity of the Zakharum site. 4 figures in the now familiar garb of Luke Olane's guards stepped into Atmos, but their interest in the tavern had nothing to do with the drink. Instead, they looked directly at Norik, their countenance darkening. He could almost swear that they knew exactly who he was. With military precision that Norik would have at other times admired, the foursome spread out, eliminating any hope of bypassing them on the way to the front entrance. Although they had not yet drawn their long curved swords, each guard kept a hand near the hilt. One wrong action by Norik, and all 4 blades would come flying out, ready to cut him down. Pretending to be not at all concerned, the wary fighter turned back to the serving girl, asking, "There's a friend I need to meet in a place located on the street behind this tavern. Do you have another exit in the back?" "There's that one way." She started to point, but he gently took her hand, dropping in another coin in it. "Thank you, Miriam." Gently pushing past her, Norik moved as if heading toward the counter for one last drink. 4 guards hesitated. Halfway to the counter, he veered toward the back doorway. Although he could not see them now, Norik felt certain that the men knew his intentions. He picked up his pace, hoping to reach the exit as quick as possible. Once out, he could try to lose himself among the growing throngs. Norik pushed the door wide, immediately darting through, and came to an abrupt halt as rough, strong hands seized him by both arms, holding him fast. "Resist, and it will go the worse for you, Westerner," snapped a swarthy guard with gold tabs on his cloak. He peered past Norik, saying, "You have done your work well. This one, we'll take it from here." The 4 who pursued Norik from inside stepped past the prisoner, pausing only to salute the officer in charge before wandering off. Norik grimacing, realizing that he had walked into the most basic of traps. He had no idea as the intentions of his captors, but at the moment they interested him far less than the question as to why Bartek's armor had not reacted. Surely this situation called for something from it, but so far it seemed unwilling to try to free its host. Why? "Pay attention, Westerner." The officer came close to slapping Norik, but finally lowered his hand. "Come peacefully and you'll not be mistreated. Resist!" The man's hand now slipped to the hilt of his curved sword, his meaning quite clear. Norik nodded his understanding. If the armor chose not to resist, he certainly had no intention of trying to fight himself free of his armed patrol. His captors formed a square of sorts, with their leader in front and Norik, of course, in the middle. The party headed down the street, away from the larger crowds. Several curious folk watched from the procession, but no one seemed at all sympathetic for the foreigners' troubles. Likely, they figured that they were always more outsiders. So what difference the loss of one? No one had yet explained exactly for what reason Norik had been arrested, but he had to assume it had something to do with the Hawksfire's arrival. Perhaps he had been wrong when he thought that no one watched but at the port. Perhaps Luke Olane kept a more wary eye on those who arrived by ship than appearances had suggested. It also remained possible that Captain Costco had, after all, reported the going-ons aboard his vessel, and the one responsible for the loss of his crew. The lead guard suddenly veered toward a narrow side street, the rest of the group following close behind. Norik frowned, no longer thinking of Costco and the Hawksfire. His captors now journeyed through the less frequented, more disreputable-looking avenues into which even the brightest day would have had trouble shedding light. The soldier tensed, something suddenly awry with the situation. They journeyed a little farther, then turned into an alley nearly as dark as night. The band proceeded a few yards into it, then the guards came to an abrupt halt. His captor stood at attention, seeming to barely even breathe. In fact, the 4 guards stood at attention with such stillness that Norik could not help to think that they resembled nothing more than the puppets those master had seized, pulling their strings. And, as if to verify that notion, a portion of the shadow separated from the rest, shaping itself into an elderly, wrinkled man with long silver hair and beard and clad in an elegant, broad-shouldered robe clearly fashioned in the style worn by someone Nork had known so very well. Fautzen. However, this figure, this Vajera, had not only lived far longer than Nork's unfortunate friend, but by being here evidenced quite well the fact that his abilities far outstripped those of the dead mage. "Leave us!" he ordered the guards, his voice strong and commanding, despite his advanced years. The officer and his men obediently turned, marching back the way they had come. "They will recall nothing," the Vajera commented, "as the others who aided them will recall nothing, just as I desire." When Nork attempted to speak, the silver-haired figure cut him off, but with a singular glance. "And if you hope to live, Westerner, you too will do as I desire." "Exactly as I desire."